whether we can call India a democratic country, etc. But let not think about those things. So these ideas of nation and democracy have started creating their own critics by themselves. The Western model showed signs of self-reflexive absurdity when it tried adapting itself to South Asian polity as a consequence of Western colonial intervention. The subsequent events in the Indian subcontinent of partition, its annulment and repartition are the most substantial illustrations of the deficiency of the Western model, the most abysmal harvest of which was reaped by the West when Great Britain and Ireland came to blows and saw fractures that turned truths of nationhood and democracy on their heads. An Urdu writer like Sadat Hasan Manto, reviewing the partition of 1947, served to collapse the borders between imaginary spaces at a time when two distant places were trying ironically to construct borders in much the same way. I'll be discussing, as you all know, Toba Singh. So, in his short story Toba Singh, first published in an Urdu magazine Savera, Manto creates what can be called an extended community, or extended imagined community, whose psychological bearings evince an underlying pattern that tends to defy civilizational constructs of nation and democracy. In fact, when he wrote this, he had migrated to Pakistan and his energies were at their lowest ebb in more than 1 week. You know, and since he had migrated to Pakistan in 1948, he had been leading a life of agonized existence. He was constantly plagued by memories of the past. Mantu could never bring himself to feel that he really belonged to Pakistan. In addition to this, his increasing poverty and failing health drove him to alcoholism. I don't know whether you have seen the movie, one directed by Nandita Das on Mantu. So, if you do get a chance, please watch it. So, his increasing poverty and failing health drove him to alcoholism, and there came a time in his life when he almost got admitted to a mental asylum because his circumstances, coupled with his attitude to life, had pushed him into a deep depression. Manto locates this particular story, Toba Singh, in a lunatic asylum, and thus takes the theme of partition to the world of insane, highlighting the political absurdity of the partition itself, and at the same time lodges a note of protest against the powers that be, who take such momentous decisions as splitting a country into two without ever thinking of the consequences. Partition of the subcontinent into two separate geographical entities was that calamitous event in its history that changed not only its physical boundaries forever, but also altered the lives of its people in an irrevocable manner. The horror, the madness, the bestiality, the violence, the arson, looting, and rape that followed in the wake of the political decision uh, was unprecedented. Suddenly, overnight, all those secure walls of a shared tradition, shared culture, shared history came crumbling down. People of different communities who till then led a harmonious and peaceful coexistence now turned into enemies. And when we become enemies, or when we lose reason, what happens is that we become scared. So reason was the first casualty, and fear, and then rage. When we are scared, we become angry. When we become then we become insane, and then rage were its outcome. Neighbors who till yesterday would have died for each other now thirsted for one another's blood, simply because they belonged to different communities. Scenes of senseless carnage were witnessed everywhere. A communal frenzy, a hypnotic obsession with violence overtook the people on both sides of the dividing line. You know, I will now go into the text to give you an overview of how Manto begins his story. Manto writes, I quote, 2 or 3 years after partition, it occurred to the governments of Pakistan and Hindustan that, like criminal offenders, lunatics too ought to be exchanged. That is, those Muslim lunatics who were in Hindustan's insane asylums should be sent to Pakistan, and those Hindus and Sikhs who were in Pakistan's insane asylums should be confided to the care of Hindustan. There's no telling whether this idea was wise or unwise. In any case, according to the decision of the learned, high level conferences took place here and there, and finally a day was fixed for the exchange of lunatics. Thorough investigation was made. Those Muslim lunatics whose relatives were all in Hindustan were allowed to remain there. As for the rest, they were sent off to the border. Here in Pakistan, since almost all the Hindus and Sikhs had already left, the question of keeping anyone didn't even arise. As many Hindu and Sikh lunatics as there were, all of them were conveyed under police protection to the border. So we see the story begins in a manner of historical narration, and the opening line itself places it in its historical context. I am rereading the first line of the text. Quote, a couple of years after partition, it strikes the government of Pakistan, Hindustan, that they'll go for this extraordinary exchange of the prisoners. So we find that the style, I'm now unquote, and going back to my conversation, as you have heard that the style of Manto over here is that of a newspaper reporter. But the tone, you must have noticed, is mock serious, dispassionate, and somewhere along the line, a hint has been placed about the absurdity of it all when Manto takes the theme of partition to the madhouse. Just imagine, a madhouse where all the lunatics are being chained. Whether it was right to exchange madmen or not, no one knew. But the decision by those who know best, after some high level meetings, had been held on both sides. No one thought of asking the madmen what they wanted. Who will ask? Nobody will ask, isn't it? Probably because lunatics cannot make out what is right for them. Only madmen who still had their families living in Hindustan were allowed to stay, and the rest had their fate sealed. As for Hindus and Sikh madmen, the question of staying did not arise, as there were no Hindu families living in Pakistan. So all of them would have to be dispatched. Thus we find in just two short paragraphs, Manto sets the tone of the story and displays the scene of action with a strong suggestion that the madhouse we are about to enter is in fact going to be a mirror of the world outside. It is a mirror of the world outside. The omniscient narrator remains distanced from them and records objectively the events subsequent to the pronouncement of their decision. Though grounded in a particular historical context, and began in a deceptive style of reporting, we must notice the difference that will gradually emerge between the rendering of history through a chronicling of facts through a fictionalization of the same. The irony and satire at play become effective devices for exposing the horrible reality of the historical situation. So, what we find that in Toba Singh, the lunatic asylum becomes a microcosm of the world outside, and Manto focuses on the anguish of one man to bring out the trauma and tragedy of dislocation and exile faced by those innumerable others who were forced out of their hearths and homes. You know, supposing today I'm being told or you are being told, that just after half an hour you'll have to leave your house. How will you feel? So we find that even in the world of these madmen, the realization of a division of their country has gradually percolated through. This small world is peopled by men belonging to the various communities of the subcontinent, and the narrator gives us short though vivid descriptions of the same. Thus, there is a Muslim madman who has been religiously reading the Urdu Delhi Zamidar. There is the Sikh madman who wants to know why they are being sent to Hindustan when they cannot even speak their language. And there is again that Muslim madman who is overtaken by a nationalist zeal while bathing. While he was bathing, he shouts, Pakistan Jindabad, only to slip and fall and pass out. The madman who climbs a tree to deliver a 2-hour lecture on the most ticklish matter of Pakistan and Hindustan lends poignancy to the plight of those who were now forced to make a choice. He's a madman, so he climbs up a tree. You know, like we find sometimes in reality that while crossing the Howrah station, I see that it has been cordoned off. Because why? Because a madman is sitting on the top of the bridge. So here also we find that a madman is on the tree and he is delivering a 2-hour lecture. Thus, and then this madman he declares, I want to live neither in Hindustan nor in Pakistan. I had rather live on this tree. Why? Because he finds the tree to be more safe. The fact that he is a Muslim is revealed only when he is persuaded to come down and hugs his Hindu and Sikh friends because they would soon be going away. This implies that he must be a Muslim, for he will stay back. Now, two things are happening here simultaneously. On the one hand, there is a note of protest in this madman's declaration that he would rather live on a tree than be forced to make a choice between two parts of the same country. This protest simmered in the hearts of most common people who were driven out from their homes when sudden political decisions were thrust on them. Thus, gradually, we see the madhouse becoming a microcosm of the outside world. You know, though we say that, we all are same people, but, sometimes we behave just like madmen, especially when we are angry, when we are out to take the blood of another, human being. So, we have a similar situation here as that in the world outside. A political decision has been made without consulting the people, and it has been thrust upon them, leaving them with no choice but to comply. And then, we find that there is a, Hindu lawyer from Lahore. I'll Just, quote from the text. Mantu writes, there was a young Hindu lawyer from Lahore who had been rejected in love and had turned lunatic. When he heard that Amritsar had gone away into India, then he was very sad. He had fallen in love with a Hindu girl from that very city. Although she had rejected the lawyer, even in his madness, he hadn't forgotten her. What he did, he abused all those Hindu and Muslim leaders who had convened together and made Hindustan into two fragments. His beloved had become Hindustani and he Pakistani. Just, imagine. So, we find that the second noteworthy fact which emerges from the protest, I am again going back to the madman who was on the tree. This the who prefers to live on the tree is located in the manner in which he embraces his Hindu and Sikh friends and begins to cry. You know, you know, Manto tries to point out that, though in common parlance, we all are sane people, and in common parlance, they are innocent people. So we tell that they are mad, but still, this man has, humanity in him. So humanity seems to be still intact in this madhouse, though this is a madhouse. In these madmen, ironically, the mad seem to be more sinner than the so-called saint predators prowling the streets in the world beyond the confines of the asylum. The madmen in the madhouse still friendship despite differences of religion or community. You know, it does not matter to them who is a Hindu or a Muslim. It is the apparently sane people like us who have gone berserk and are killing their friends and neighbors. It is they who are saying that the place that has been your home since birth is no longer your home. So, confusion, confusion everywhere. Confusion about their status is now rampant in the madhouse. The suddenness of the change is underlined because even those madmen who were not completely mad were perplexed as to where they actually were at that moment. They knew that a person called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was known as Quadi Azam, the great leader, had created a separate nation for Muslims and had named it Pakistan. But where it was and what its geographical dimensions, no one had any idea. Manto is highlighting here a very important aspect about the gap between decision makers and the affected people. Nobody questions the affected people, nobody questions the common people. The common people are always left out. For the political leaders, it was easy to run a dividing line through the country and have, physical boundaries drawn between Hindustan and Pakistan. But for the common people, the words remained mere territorial abstractions. For them, home was where they had been born, lived, and would have died had history not played such a cruel trick. For them, it did not matter whether that home was in Pakistan or Hindustan. But if, in the name of division of the country, they were driven out of that home, then they would rather did not belong to any of these countries as long as they were allowed to live there. This hopelessness and this despair is evoked in the mild protest of the madman who would prefer to live in the tree rather than in Hindustan or Pakistan and be separated from family and friends in the process. A trajectory of the political struggle in the outside world occurs when a Muslim madman from Chinyot declares himself to be the Qadi Azam, only to have Tara Singh and challenge him. Both, writes the narrator, are removed to solitary cells as bloodshed seemed imminent. If only it were possible to have done the same in the real world, a lot of bloodshed, I think could have been avoided, which resulted from real life political confrontation. This seems to be the implied comment of Manto too. Manto next gives us some information about Bishan Singh's past and informs us how he came there in the mental asylum. Bishan Singh is the protagonist of the story, Toba Singh. Who was this Bishan Singh? He was, he has, he looks ferocious, but he is very mild mannered and harmless. He had been a wealthy landlord in Toba Singh, a small town in Pakistan. So, Toba Singh actually is a small town in Pakistan about 150 kilometers southwest of Lahore. We are told that his brain had tripped suddenly and his family had brought him to the asylum, all tied up in chains and had him locked up in the madhouse. Now, now that he is in the madhouse, he listens attentively whenever there is a discussion about the formation of Hindustan and Pakistan and about their imminent transfer from one to the other. When asked for his opinion, he replies in the same meaningless gibberish but gradually. You know, he's a madman. So what he says? The green lentils of the lantern. Green lentils of the lantern. There's no meaning. Then he says it gets replaced at first by the green lentils of the government of Pakistan and subsequently by the government of Toba Singh. It is, at that particular time that, this asking him where this Toba Singh was. How could one be certain where it was now? For such were the times that one moment Sialkot was in Pakistan and the next instant it was in Hindustan. The political leaders were saying, like we in our childhood used to take out a block from a jigsaw puzzle. So one moment Sialkot is here, the other moment there. How could anyone tell where a place was when the next instant it could be, transferred like a plastic block? The chaos and confusion evident in the actions of this madman is merely a reflection of what was actually happening in the larger world outside. Manto takes the credit for creating the chaos, the wilderness and the pathos of the situation outside through his short and deep strokes of the events in the madhouse subsequent to the news of the partition. Narrating this particular thing, when this underlining irony and the reaction of the madman, Manto adopts a tone which is laced with black humor and he brings out the absurdity of the state, highlighting the underlying irony. The omniscient narrator then proceeds to give us a short glimpse into the past, telling us about the only times when Bishan Singh would almost as if wake up from his general stupor to prepare for his visitors. All the day, he used to be in a stupor, in a trance. So, some days he would wake up from his